All right. Well, good morning. I'm sure we'll gain a few more people as we go.
Stan and Lori are out of town.
Yes, I saw that. I was like, well, they must have decided to just, they were already planning to be gone. They were supposed to be in Israel. So they must have just decided to go on vacation anyway. It is a bummer that trip got canceled, but really we're also not surprised, are we? Anyway, another time. So I have not been in here for a couple of weeks. I was out of town a couple weeks ago, and last week I was down with the Kefarim. So I have not been here, and I have not gone back and listened. So I don't know what you guys have talked about the last couple of weeks. So hopefully I don't repeat things too much, but is there anything, if you were here, is there anything that stands out from the last couple of weeks? I think it was Kenny 2 weeks ago, and then last week was Miguel. If you were here, if anybody.
It's really, really good.
It was really good. Well, I'm sure it was so good. I know, I was especially sad to miss last week, because last week had the Yom Kippur service in Leviticus 16, and that's like the high point. And I was like, I saw Miguel during the week. He came into McLean's that week before one day, and I was talking to him. I was like, I'm gonna miss it, but I'm so excited for you guys to get to talk about it. It's gonna be so good. So I'm sure it was great. I should go back and listen to it, but I didn't get a chance to go back and catch up on all that this week. So if there's anything that comes up as we go, we can feel free to bring it out. But this week, our portion is chapters 19 and 20. It's called Kedoshim, which is the holy ones. So we've kind of reached our turning point in Leviticus and the Torah as a whole, actually. So kind of, I've mentioned this before, but just kind of like a refresher. So the first half of Leviticus is kind of this, it's about worship and ritual purity within the tabernacle and for the community. The sacrificial system gets laid out, what we learn about ritual purity and all of those kinds of things. And then the second half of Leviticus is kind of turns toward holiness. And so it's looking toward like kind of character issues and being holy and set apart in the way that God has designed, which kind of makes sense and is kind of cool coming out of the Yom Kippur instructions of, cleansing the tabernacle, which is really one of the interesting things about that description is it starts out before it gives all the instructions saying that this is what Adonai spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's two sons, which that would have their approach of God in a way that was not what he had instructed kind of defiles the tabernacle in a sense. And so then it's like, okay, well now we have to restore order. And God is also saying, I do want you to approach, you just have to do it in a particular way. So that's some of what's going on. There's a lot going on with the Yom Kippur traditions, but that's some of it. And so now we've got this kind of this understanding of like, it's a really big deal to enter the presence of God and for the high priest to go into the Holy of Holies. And so there's this element of needing the community to maintain this element of holiness so that they can approach to worship in whatever part of the tabernacle they're going into, as well as helping the priest maintain purity and holiness to be able to go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. So we've kind of hit a shift. So this portion is a little interesting because it's really kind of is one of those that like where the portion breaks are, like kind of breaks in the middle of a kind of a greater thing that's happening. Because really most of the time, I probably looked at 3 or 4 different sources this week, and they all kind of look at 18 through 20 as a set. And so it's interesting, but our portion is only 19 and 20. So we might pull in some 18 just to see kind of some of the patterns. We're going to spend most of the time in 19, but it is kind of this, because the broader framework is that in 18 and 20 have a lot of mirroring, and these are both chapters that have all of these very specific don't do this kind of relationships. Like this is a lot of where we get our understanding of marriage and things like that. And it's like, don't have all these relationships. It's not going to go well. So 18 like lays a lot of those out, and 20 lays them out again and then brings a lot of the consequences for them. So there, and then right in the middle we have 19, which is kind of this holiness thing. The TLV titles it the Holiness Code. I don't remember what other translations title it, but but really scholars refer to like 17 through the end of Leviticus as the Holiness Code, but chapter 19 has that title specifically. So so that's kind of the broader framework, and so we'll kind of look at it in that sense a little bit. So so part of this holiness code, a lot of what's going on in this second half of Leviticus, which we see some in the first half as well in a different way, but a lot of what these instructions are about have to do with making how Israel is set apart. We know Israel is this set apart nation, and this is how that happens and what that looks like, really, I guess we could say. And again, it's one of those, I think we lose some of the distinction and some of the contrast because we tend to not, at least I have not studied in great detail lots of other like ancient cultures, and so we don't see the contrast so much, but the ancient people would have seen that very much. So it's interesting to kind of bring some of those things out. Occasionally I'll come across it in my reading and I'll be like, other cultures would do, like this was really common. And it's like, oh, that's why it's so specific about this, because they're creating this contrast. And it's interesting too to think about like where this is happening. So Leviticus is unique in that it doesn't really have like a timestamp. Like we've been moving through story and through time, right, in Genesis and Exodus. And then when we get to Numbers, we will, again, see lots of time markers that they spend this much time here and then they move and all these things. And Leviticus, we don't really see that. Leviticus is kind of inside and outside of time in some sense. But it's understood that much of the instruction from Leviticus came from Moses' time at Mount Sinai. And so it kind of has this image that they're kind of camped out at the mountain of the Lord while they're receiving this revelation. It may have happened more over time while they were traveling around, I don't know. But the picture we kind of get is that they're at Mount Sinai when they receive all of this. So that means they're kind of between Egypt and Canaan. So they're between coming out of Egypt and before they go into the Promised Land. And I think that that's really kind of significant. And that was something that was kind of standing out to me as I was thinking about some of this. And I liked this quote from a book called The Torah Story. It says, the nature of Israel as a holy nation is accented by their distinction from the peoples of both Egypt and Canaan. They are called to be different from those where they came from and from those where they are going. The place of the people at the mountain of God's revelation between Egypt and Canaan reinforces the ethical dimension of the call to holiness. So we kind of get this idea that it's kind of like really kind of the Lord. There's this whole thing, like the wilderness is like, they spent 40 years out there, but really, and that, in some sense, that's a consequence because they didn't have the faith to go in. But, and on another level, they kind of have, it's kind of like this, they kind of get to have this little bubble. They kind of get to live in a vacuum a little bit to learn how to live how God is calling them at, because they're not in Egypt, they've been in Egypt for 400 years. First as kind of, they weren't enslaved at first, of course, but they were still not in their own land, and they were still a guest. Yeah, they were a guest, and so they had it. It was going well at first, but they still weren't. They were still kind of subject to the law of the land in some sense. And then, of course, becoming enslaved, they're much more limited there. And then Canaan has all of these established cultures and rituals and pagan things going on. And God's like, you can't be like either one of them. So we're going to learn what this looks like in this little kind of almost protected space in some sense. And he's also providing them food and water. Their clothes are not wearing out. All these things. Like he kind of puts them in this place where they kind of have things provided for so they can learn how to be this God people that God has created them to be. And I just thought that was really significant and really cool to think about. So with that, I kind of want to get into some of Leviticus 19. So this chapter covers a lot. It covers a lot of territory. In some ways, I don't know if you noticed this while you were reading through it. As you read through it, it reads a little bit like what? What does it? Are there things that stick out to you that it reminds you of that are like of other things in other parts of the Bible? Does it remind you of anything?
It reminds me of the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, it reminds me of that too. Yeah.
Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those were the two big ones that came to mind for me. Is it's very similar to the 10 words and to the Sermon on the Mount, which that's one of the cool things too. Is like that this is one of the things I love about studying the Bible and different parts of the Bible over time. Is like because reading this in Leviticus 19, I'm like, oh, that sounds like the Sermon on the Mount. But it takes a while to get all that familiarity, so it's fun when those connections just start to pop a little bit. So the 10 words and the Sermon on the Mount. There was another one that came up when I was reading something. I don't remember what it was, but anyway, but parts of this, a couple verses particularly, and maybe we'll find them as we go, are very often quoted or referenced or alluded to in the New Testament writings. So it's important. So maybe we'll just start going through a little bit, and we'll just kind of see what pops out and what we want to talk about. I have a few notes about a few things, but you're also welcome to jump in if anything pops out to you. So we'll just kind of take this maybe a few verses at a time and see how it goes. So I'll read verses maybe 1 through 8 to start out with. Okay. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of Bnei Israel and tell them, you shall be kedoshim, holy ones, for I, Adonai your God, am holy. Each of you is to respect his mother and his father and keep my Shabbatot, Sabbath. I am Adonai your God. Do not turn to idols or make molten gods for yourself. I am Adonai your God. When you bring a sacrifice of fellowship offering to Adonai, you are to offer it so that you may be accepted. It is to be eaten the same day that you offer it and the next day. But if anything remains until the third day, it is to be burned with fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is disgusting. It will not be accepted. Rather, anyone who eats it will bear his iniquity, since he has profaned what is holy to Adonai, and that soul will be cut off from his people." Okay, so already we have lots of different things. We have honoring your father and mother, keeping the Shabbat, not making idols or molten gods, how to bring a sacrifice, when to eat the sacrifice, and the consequences for not doing it properly. So already some of this very much is like the 10 words, right? Honoring your father and mother, keeping the Shabbat, not serving other gods, those kinds of things. Anything else in those verses pop out to
Do you
you?
have any insight into the soul that will be cut off from his people? I feel like I saw that phrase in 18 as well.
Yeah, that phrase comes up.
Sounds so extreme.
It does, yes.
Are there different translations that
There
word it differently?
might be, and I should have probably brought it. I was reading Robert Alter's translation, who's a Jewish scholar, and his translation was really interesting up for a lot of this, and I thought about bringing it, and then I didn't end up grabbing it before it came. But it points to this whole, like, a lot of it has to do with, so, like, the soul is connected with the life. And a lot of times, I don't know, I have to look up this specific one, but a lot of times when that comes up, it's nefesh, it's this life. It's similar to, like, when it talks about the life being in the blood, and that's why you don't eat the blood of the animal or whatever. So it's making a point that it's really serious,
Yeah.
right? Like, because you're right, it does sound really extreme.
Yeah.
And And there's this interesting debate, and it comes up in different scholars, and it's interesting to see how different people, the bent different people kind of have is like, because the biggest consequences we see for things are you're cut off from your people,
Right.
which basically means
Cast out.
you're cast out of the community to fend for yourself, which likely means
A death sentence.
a death sentence. And then sometimes the consequence is a death sentence.
Yeah.
So it's kind of death or death. It's just whether it's immediate or
Slow or fast.
slower.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is kind of really sad to think about. But there's kind of this, it's like, which is worse, being cut off from your people and having to go and try and live on your own, or just being put to death?
Right.
Like, which is, I don't know. They're both really serious consequences, obviously. And both make a statement to the rest of the people. Anybody have any?
Verse 6 makes me just think, I know he's talking about what we give him, but him giving us our gifts and basically don't abuse them. That's what the third day makes me think of. Yeah, you're giving this gift,
Mm-hmm.
but then you can only go as far as God wants you to go.
Yeah.
Beyond that point, you start abusing it.
Yeah.
That's just
Just a thought of death being, separated from the source of life. And there's so many lessons there that he's saying, choose life so that choose well so that you will live. Like, my ways keep you safe. If you don't, you will be cut off.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll die one way or the other. Spiritual death, physical death.
Yeah, and I think there's also an element too of, and I think this might be the case in this, because this, it seems like this seems like a really intense consequence for something like when you eat the sacrifice, right? But think about it, and this comes up in several places, and this is something that the Lord has brought up to me several times in several different contexts through life and through how the scripture, because it's often when you run into these, this seems like a really extreme consequence for this in our minds. It's like my thought process as I try to wind back through that is but he's trying, I think the Lord is trying to make this don't make an allowance for a little bit, because eventually a little bit becomes a lot of deviance from what he's saying, right? And I think we see that through time, through history, you make you make a slight allowance for something that you wouldn't have allowed before, and before you know it, everything is different, right? And you can't say no to anything, and everything has to be acceptable. We're seeing a lot of that happening in the body of Messiah as a whole right now.
If you cut off you have to remove the gangrenous arm
Yeah.
to save the body.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have to separate them.
Yeah. So I think some of this is making a statement of it's you don't even get to move a little bit. It's holding the line. And again, I look at this process through the Torah, through the wilderness years especially, as this growing in relationship type of thing. And another side, another kind of facet to all of this too is even you think of parents, when with smaller children, you have to be really black or white. You do this and not do that. And as you get older, like with a stove, it's when you're little, you do not touch it. Well, then you get older and more mature. Well, then you learn how to interact with it, right? You learn how to be around hot things without getting burned. And I think there's some of that too. This is we're still in a really new setting this up, and it's and they're being influenced. They're still influenced by other cultures around them and sacrifice and things like that. And God is no, you don't do it like they do it. You do it like I said. So I think I think some of that comes in of the soul being cut off from his people is which again, going back to, I think what Faith was saying, of this life source, to be cut off from your people is to be cut off from the Lord and from your community that protects you. So it's a big deal. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, well, let's keep going then. Let's see. We will look at. Let's do this next. Maybe I'll do like 9 through 13. When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap to the very corners of your field, nor are you to gather the gleanings of your harvest. You are not to pick the remnant of your vineyard, nor are you to gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. Instead, you are to leave them for the poor and for the outsider. I am Adonai your God. You are not to steal, you are not to lie, you are not to deceive one another. You are not to swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God. I am Adonai. You are not to oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired servant are not to remain with you all night until the morning. Right. Again, lots of wide range of talkings in here, of topics, I mean. So it's about the harvest, it's about not lying and deceiving, about paying your workers, not swearing by the name of the Lord. That's an interesting one. So, anything in particular stick out in that little section? Or make you think of other parts of the Bible, or do you see applications of any of this anywhere else in the Bible or anything like that?
Seems like a theme of working against our natural fleshly inclinations towards selfishness and self-preservation, and setting them up to where they have to rely on the Lord instead of on themselves.
Right. Yeah.
Just not going all the way to the corners. And
Right.
not going back to pick up what you dropped.
Right. Right.
And I would say too, it's training us to think of others,
Right.
even greater than ourselves, the needs of other people.
Yeah. And we see this, not reaping to the corners, gathering all the grapes, whatever. We see this in a couple places. Like, so Ruth, story of Ruth, like we see this playing out with Ruth, right?
Yeah.
When Boaz is like clear of like, you like reinforcing to his workers of like, don't go back, make sure you leave some for her, right? Basically.
Right.
And then we see Yeshua and his disciples going through and picking wheat. So we see that this is happening. But yeah, I think what you said, Hillary, of just like not being selfish, like this kind of demonstration of what
boundaries.
Yeah.
To keep ourselves.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
our natural bent.
Yeah, and to not be greedy too, like not trying to squeeze every last bit or every last penny or whatever out of something.
Well, it's interesting that he repeats that phrase, I am Adonai.
Mm-hmm.
I am Adonai. Like, I am the Lord, not you,
Right.
not these false gods.
Yeah.
Not the sun, the moon, the harvest. It's me.
Right.
It seems to be a counter response to our instincts of wanting to provide for ourselves in our own way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I was waiting for someone to bring that one up. How many times it says I'm Adonai. And yeah, there's definitely this understood idea of that when it says, I am Adonai your God, or I am Adonai whatever, that it's this reminder of his holiness and like his authority and it's all these things. We could probably talk forever about all of that. But it actually it shows up. This came up in my reading this week too. That phrase is 16 times in this chapter alone.
Wow.
That's a lot of times.
Yep.
And it says, and I didn't count, so I don't know if I agree with this count because I didn't go count for myself. 16 times in the midst of 52 laws in chapter 19. It's a lot. And I can't remember where I read this one actually. This might have been in the Torah story. I think it was. I didn't write down where I read this one, but often where it says I am Adonai has to do with it seems to be often connected with things that happen privately, decisions you would make privately. So there's kind of this public and private, individual and corporate reality to all of this, right? Because the ultimate goal is the holiness of the community as a whole. But for a community to be to be holy, the individuals have to be holy, right? And then there's this. I thought that I was thinking about that too. This public and private dimension of it. And so, what's our takeaway of that? Is that holiness matters in what you do that others can see and what others can't in your own heart, which a lot of that plays into some of the stuff that comes up in 18 and 22.
Well, just as a general rule, like we're not autonomous, we're not.
Right.
What we do affects others.
For sure.
Even privately.
Yeah.
Sometimes we forget that.
Yeah.
Something too, when the kingdom, during the millennial kingdom, when the New Jerusalem is described, when you see those that will be excluded, no idolaters, no liars, it's like he is continually creating a safe place for those who will be there.
Yeah.
And so these tests of, that we all experience are preparing us for that day.
Right.
It seems.
Yeah. Which again shows that the character of God and holiness of God is consistent, right? Because if that's what it's saying here, and that's what it's saying when we're talking about the millennial kingdom and age to come, then it must matter from then until then. It matters all the way through, so the rules don't change in some sense, which is a big debate about how we look at this, and we could talk a little bit more about that as we go too, but about how we apply a lot of this now, because the challenge for us when we look at some of these passages is that it makes sense that God would instruct all of this, especially while the tabernacle or the temple is in their midst. Because a lot of this about holiness and about remaining pure and about all of these things has to do with being able to go into the tabernacle or the temple, whatever phase we're talking about at the time. And when we don't have those physical places, it's like the questions tends to come up of like, well then why does this matter if we're not going into a temple or a tabernacle? And I tend to always go back to the whole idea that many times in the New Testament it tells us that we are the tabernacle. And so if God is going to dwell in us, then there has to be some connection to this idea of holiness. I'm not saying that maybe it doesn't look a little bit different outwardly in some cases, because of course we're not bringing animal sacrifices and we're not doing those things. But again, going back to what we see here in the public and the private, like our internal decision making and our internal thoughts in ourselves matters, as well as how we act towards others outwardly and how we represent the Lord outwardly. So I think the principles all still apply, and I don't think I probably have to convince you all too much of that. But those are questions that often comes up, and so I always try to be thinking about how to respond to some of that as I'm looking at passages like this. So one in particular in this little section that we're looking at is verse 12. You are not to swear by my name falsely and so profane the name of your God. I am Adonai. So what does that mean? Because right before that, he talks about you don't steal, you don't lie, or deceive one another. But then he's very specific that you don't swear by his name or to profane his name.
He says to swear by it falsely. Does that mean there is a time and place for swearing by his name appropriately?
That's a good question. There's other passages that talk about, being kind of beware of making oaths and vows and things like that.
Your yes be yes.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, this is very clear of not doing it falsely. So I think it does suggest that there may be times when that it's appropriate. But I think the point is you have to be really careful about it.
Right.
Because that can be super harmful if
Yeah.
if someone says something, thus saith the Lord, and
Right.
the Lord did not say it.
Right.
And that's another thing that we see in a contemporary way.
Yeah.
And those
Right.
judgments kind of happen.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's something to be really careful about, and it's like, and it's one of those things that becomes complicated, and it's one of the, like, if you follow this train of thought, you can see why it has happened that there are parts of the body who kind of just don't go there, who don't, like, as far as gifts of the Spirit is like prophecy and words of knowledge and all these, all these prophetic type giftings, particularly. Like if you think about this and carry this out, you can see why they've made that decision, why they've gone that. It's like, or the cessationist idea. I'm having trouble with my words this morning. And because it gets really messy. Because what do you do when you have two people standing in front of you that are saying the Lord said this, and this person is saying the Lord said this, and they're not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're opposite sides of the same topic. What do you do with that? Right? And that can get really messy, which is why, if you've noticed, here at Kingdom Living, we very much have a practice of not saying, "Thus saith the Lord," of saying, like, I have this sense, I feel like what I heard the Lord was saying, and kind of submitting it for testing, and rather than saying, the Lord said this.
Yeah.
Unless we're like looking at the Lord said this,
Mm-hmm.
we kind of tend to not use that. And this is a main reason why. And I've been places where I've heard places say, the Lord is saying, and then they say, and I'm like, be really careful what you say right now. Oh, that's really scary. And I'm not saying that they're always wrong, right? But it, again, like going back to what we're saying, it's like, we need to feel the weight of that. Like if we're saying the Lord said something, we better be really sure he said it, right? Yeah, because it's like, because you're talking about like profaning the name of the Lord. And I think this becomes really, I think this is really important in our current context, is like, as believers that are supposed to be becoming more like Yeshua, we're representing the Lord on the earth. And so it matters how we represent him and how we, and what we say, and that we want to make sure we're not profaning the name of the Lord. I feel like kind of the fear of the Lord on that. And so I'm like, oh, help us, Lord.
I'm surprised that there's not a soul will be cut off from his people attached to
Right.
that one.
Right. I know. That would make sense that would be there, right? Or it's like, or I don't know, maybe that one would be even a put to death. I don't know.
Because earlier in the chapter, when you read about eating the sacrifice even on the third
Right.
day, it says that anyone who eats it will bear his iniquity, since he has profaned what is holy to Adonai.
Right.
So another example of profaning.
Yeah. Yeah, so it comes down to, and this was kind of in some of the things I was reading this week, this idea comes up. It's like, when we talk about profaning the name of the Lord, or what you were just mentioning too, profaning what is holy, there is this idea of the fact that it kind of points us to this idea that it is possible for us to, and this is what we were saying anyway, but kind of compromising God's reputation, and distorting what holiness looks like by how we talk about this. That's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking profaning it. And it's like particularly in this, like the Israelites, the Jewish people, are to be this set apart holy nation, right? And then it extends that to all believers in Yeshua later in the New Testament. In 1 Peter 2, I think is like, it talks about believers as this holy nation set apart. So there's this idea of like, not profaning or defiling what it means to speak in his name or to represent him, and that we are very capable. And I think it's really easy to see throughout history, is like we're really capable of damaging his reputation and misrepresenting him. And it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. So it's always like this reminder. It's like, okay, I need to think about what you say, right? Be slow to speak, right? Yeah.
Just it's kind of saying the same thing, but just to bring in the term false prophets, because
Yeah.
we are warned against there will be many
Yeah.
false prophets.
Yeah.
And even, another thing that comes to mind when they are saying peace and safety, because of the false prophets will say peace and safety when actually God is about to bring a judgment.
Yeah.
Then suddenly this will happen.
Mm-hmm.
So just, it's a pretty profound thing.
Yeah. So it's important to be, that's why it's important that we study the Word of God, that we do life in community, that we do kind of wrestle and test through what we think the Lord is saying, to kind of continue to like tune our, fine tune our hearing of what the Lord is saying and doing. That's why, but it's community, because especially like a lot of times, and this is one of the things that we teach here as well, is like even looking at ministries or Bible teachers or prophets or anything like that, is looking at who are they connected to. Because not saying not to listen to any of those people, but often the ones who you start to like, as you follow them, they start to kind of feel like they're getting a little off track or something somewhere. They're often not affiliated with anyone. It's this guy in his ministry, and he doesn't have a covering or connection to other authority, or there's not a good structure of accountability and things like that. And again, I'm not saying that necessarily all those things that people like that are saying are not true. I'm just saying be careful, right? We have to have some wisdom and discernment of who we're listening to. We don't want to just be sponges that take everything, because it's going to get messy real fast. So there is safety in a structure of accountability and things like that. So yeah. Again, these are things that, and again, I'm not saying Kale necessarily is perfect in all of these areas, but this is why we function. I'm just using that as examples of why we function the way we do in some of these areas. Okay. Should we move on? Okay. So let's look at we'll do 14 through 18. You are not to curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall fear your God. I am Adonai. You are to do no injustice in judgment. You are not to be partial toward the poor, nor show favoritism toward the great, but you are to judge your neighbor with fairness. You are not to go up and down as a talebearer among your people. You are not to endanger the life of your neighbor. I am Adonai. You are not to hate your brother in your heart. Instead, you are to firmly rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. You are not to take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai. Okay. So this section is maybe a bit more cohesive in that it all kind of pertains to how you treat other people in different categories, maybe, but
Treat them how you want to be treated.
right. That is it seems to be a simpler way to say it, right? Think about how you want to be treated, and then treat other people like that.
If you were deaf, if you were blind,
Right.
if you were poor.
Yeah. So an interesting comment I thought about that verse about the deaf and blind. I think this was Robert Alter when I was reading his commentary. He points out that it says you are not to curse the deaf, but he's like, but what's interesting about that is the deaf person wouldn't know, they can't hear you. But the blind person, but if you're putting a stumbling block in front of a blind person, they're gonna know that. Like
Well,
they will
may not
experience.
have known you put it there.
They might not. You're right.
They might just think it was an object.
But there's going to be a felt experience in their life.
Sure. Physically.
So they were drawing a distinction. Your point is a good one. That I don't know that it's so different, but I just thought this was an interesting way. So they were talking about like the unknown kind of speaking against versus the known kind of malicious act. And it's like, and I was like, this is so interesting that they're drawing the distinction in this, but
I
that's
see
what they
them
do
as
sometimes.
both taking advantage of a weakness
Absolutely.
of another.
Yes, and that is absolutely what's happening.
More what I see.
So he was saying that the takeaway is that it's calling to like a higher moral standard across the board, whether the person again going back to the public versus private action of like whether the person knows it or not, like there's this higher moral standard of how you treat people just across the board, whether they know you're speaking ill of them or not.
Right.
Like it matters. And so it's kind of like this raising the bar, which is really similar to when we were mentioning that there's much of this chapter makes us think of the Sermon on the Mount. It makes us think about Yeshua when he kind of raises the bar. It's like, if you even think about some of this stuff, you are committing the sin. And coming back to, again, it always comes back to where's your heart, and what's your motivation, and what's kind of going on internally that causes those external actions. It's not just about how you act outwardly. So consistent themes. Yeah. Uh-huh.
16, that would be the same as a gossip, correct?
Yeah. I think this verse about in 17, you're not to hate your brother in your heart. Instead, you're to firmly rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. So this is kind of a situation where you see someone that's doing something they shouldn't, and by choosing to not kind of call them up and rebuke them for it, the outcome could be that you're causing yourself to sin, because then you would have you looking at them, looking down upon them or something. But if you don't say anything, then whose fault is it really? I mean, it's both still, but I think I didn't write down where this quote came from either. That's interesting. I think this was Robert Alter. He says, witnessing immoral behavior without attempting to intervene, the observer may feel resentment or contempt toward the perpetrator, who in fact might conceivably have been dissuaded from the act by reproof. So saying, like, you could be feeling resentment or contempt toward them, but really they might have totally, like, it might have been like, oh, thank you for correcting me, and like things might have been totally changed, and they might have immediately stopped that had you just brought it up. So it's this whole, like, not letting things fester in you, right? And also, like, if we are called to keep each other accountable and kind of call out some of those blind spots or something like that we might have. So it's not comfortable, especially for us Midwesterners who are always like, we're supposed to be kind to each other. But it is kind to call people up, and I think we have to remember that. Like, that is actually kindness, even though it's uncomfortable, and some of us don't like confrontation.
Well, it's the two different preaching styles also. You preach on love or you preach on fire and brimstone. You have to show both.
Yeah.
There's consequences.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he loves you.
Right, yeah, we need the love and mercy, and we need the judgment.
And there's, I think it's Matthew 5 about don't bring your offering.
Yeah.
If you know your brother has something
have
against you,
offense.
we're actually commanded to go and try to be reconciled
Right,
with it.
right. So it goes back to, the relationship is important, right? Authentic relationship is really important. That's really good. All right. Anything else in that section? We're doing good. We might make it all the way through the chapter. All right. Well, let's look at. We'll go 19 through 22. You must keep my statutes. You are not to crossbreed different kinds of animals. You are not to sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor are you to wear a garment woven with two kinds of material. If a man lies sexually with a woman who is a slave girl, pledged to be married to another man, but not ransomed or given her freedom, they are both to be punished. But they are not to be put to death because she was not free. He is to bring his trespass offering to Adonai to the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram for a guilt offering. The Cohen is to make atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering before Adonai for his sin that was committed, and the sin that he committed will be forgiven him. So this is an interesting one.
Yeah, that feels more culturally specific to
It does.
the kind of situation that
Yes.
they
Yes.
find themselves in.
Right.
So it's a little hard to translate that
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
just apart from don't be sexually immoral.
Right. Right. Which again, if we were looking more closely at 18 and 20, we would have a very expanded view of that. So yeah, you're right. And again, like this is like a so this one is more culturally specific.
But I would guess that in the neighboring cultures, interactions with slaves were not seen as anything
Right.
to be paid attention to.
Right.
So the fact that he's calling them to a certain level of accountability, even in interactions with enslaved people,
Yes.
helps set them apart
Yes.
as just valuing all life.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I think we have the kind of the double, both the issue of slavery and the issue just of women in general. Because yeah, in many cultures, whether a woman was actually a slave or not,
May not have mattered.
it may not have mattered. So yeah, this is definitely a calling higher, a set apart, and it's like you have to do this. And actually, I'm not going to go into the whole slavery conversation, but even the type of like what slavery means here is very different than often where our minds go when we think of slavery. But still, but yes, I think that is important to realize too. Is just like again going back to this idea of what's commonly accepted among other cultures was not okay in Israel, because the Lord was like, yeah, we do value people. You don't get to view anyone as property or less than. And that even, I mean, it even goes back to what we had earlier. We didn't really talk about it as much, but like not being partial toward the poor or favoritism toward the great. The point is that all people are valuable, and we're not supposed to cater to the wealthy, or elevate the poor or look down on the poor. It's this. You treat people how you want to be treated.
I mean, and it seems like he keeps pointing out to us, you have what you have because of me.
Right.
Or you don't have what
Right.
you don't have because of me.
Right.
It's not because of your own doing.
Right.
It's not because of your own power or abilities.
Right.
So if you're granted a lot, can't take it personally. If you weren't, can't take it personally.
Yeah, and I think that that's important to think about too, because again, we talked about like they're right now living in a wilderness where all their food and water is being supplied supernaturally, and they have the manifest presence of God in their midst. And the message that we're seeing throughout all of these instructions is not about earning favor. Like the point and the purpose and the motivation toward being holy is just that you get to keep the presence of God in your midst. And that's what we should want above all else, is to have his presence with us. But it's not about earning favor so that to promote yourself and to raise your own status. It's about following the Lord and having right relationship with the Lord and right relationship with each other. So it's definitely a different construct, because other cultures are worshiping and sacrificing to their gods, but they're doing it to earn favor or to get what they want. Basically, they're trying to please the God so that the God will do what they want, instead of worshiping God because he's holy and he's worthy of our worship. So yeah, it's definitely a big contrast to some of these other nations. Okay, let's keep going, because we're gonna finish. We can do it. I can do it.
Go team.
I mean, really, the problem is that I get carried away talking about stuff. Okay, so let's see. 20. We'll look at 23 through. We'll do a little longer. We'll go through 29 maybe. Okay. When you come into the land and have planted all kinds of trees for food, you are to consider their fruit as forbidden. 3 years it is to be forbidden to you. It is not to be eaten. Then in the 4th year all its fruit will be holy, for giving praise to Adonai. In the 5th year you may eat its fruit, so it will yield its increase to you. I am Adonai your God. You are not to eat any meat with the blood still in it, nor are you to use enchantments or practice sorcery. You are not to round off the hair on the sides of your head, nor are you to mar the edges of your beard. You are not to make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead or make any tattoo marks upon yourself. I am Adonai. Do not defile your daughter to make her a prostitute so that the land does not fall into prostitution and become full of wickedness. Okay. There's a lot of things in there.
Really interesting.
It is really interesting. So let's look at some of this, and I don't necessarily have a lot to say about this, but I think it's really interesting. This idea of the trees, the fruit of the land. So this whole 3 years it's forbidden, and this is where Robert Alter's translation was really interesting because he actually, and I didn't go look at the Hebrew because I just didn't have time, but that you are to consider the fruit uncircumcised is how he says it, which I was like, that's really interesting. So I haven't quite wrapped my head around all of that, but it's this really interesting idea of they have to wait. They don't get to eat the fruit until the 5th year. And also in the 4th year, all of this holy, given praise to Adonai. It's referred to as a jubilee in some translations.
But it sounds like you're still not supposed to eat it.
Right. So it's for the Lord. So, what do we make of that? I don't know that I
I
necessarily
guess I
know.
would just trust the creator of the plant
Mhm.
to know the best way to cultivate the most fruit.
Right.
There must be something to that.
So what's really interesting is I'm reading a book right now that is that's about vineyards. It's talking about this wisdom of, because the vineyards and grapevines are used as imagery throughout the Bible a lot. So it's talking about that. And so kind of interwoven with some of what the Lord might be saying about this, they're kind of talking in general terms of the process of maturing and growing vines. And it's really interesting. And in there, I think it's 3 years before they can, before they actually let the grapevines fruit. They cut it all, they prune it all back for the first 3 years. They don't let it fruit for the first 3 years. But by then, the vine is strong enough to actually support good fruit. And I'm like, that's really interesting. So, I mean, you can draw all kinds of connections of what that means for us and how we relate to that. I don't know. So we don't have to go on that, but I think it's interesting. But that's what I was thinking of as I was reading this, because I've been reading this other book. But yeah, I think it goes down to I think it also goes back to what we were talking about earlier, of not being selfish, and not trying to force, and even how we care for the land, and not just forcing a large harvest when it's not actually good for that tree or that plant or something like that. I'm not really a plant person, so I don't know a ton, but it's but these are things that I hear of and even letting land lie fallow for, to regenerate the soil and things like that. There's all these things. So it's really important in how you do that. So that's all I have about that, unless somebody else has something else. But I just thought that was really interesting.
Could be kind of a foreshadowing for
Mhm.
first fruits.
Yeah.
So we get first fruits out there.
Yeah.
And, the 3 years it's growing and getting stronger and producing. And then the 4th year, when it probably really does
Mhm.
produce the first fruits that would be edible, you give it to the Lord.
Yeah.
And then after that,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think it also maybe points toward, because I don't think we've talked about the Jubilee at all yet in the Torah, really. I don't think we've gotten to the Jubilee sections yet. But in the Jubilee, the plant, they're basically, their harvest is kind of the reverse of this, but their harvest has to last them for 3 years, basically, when you get to the Jubilee, because it's a Shabbat year that you let it lie fallow, and then you let it lie the Jubilee year, and then you have to grow again. That you have to wait through the growing season of that year one, So it's almost like the reverse of that, of the reverse. This is the patience and to not force it, and then it's but then the reverse of that is when you do need it to last, you need it for the 3 years. The Lord has to provide it. So I don't know. I don't know if that might be a stretch to make that connection, but it came to mind. It came to mind when we were talking about the first fruits. What were you saying, Hillary?
Oh, there's just number 3.
Yeah. 3's, it comes up, right?
Uh-huh.
All right, and then we have these interesting instructions about not eating meat with blood, enchantments and sorcery, always fun topics, not cutting the edge of your beard, marks in your flesh, tattoos, defiling your daughter. We just got all kinds of really fun things right here in this little section. kind of rapid fire. It's like, wow, that's a lot. So I don't know. I mean, anything in particular people have questions or want to talk about in that little section?
So if I'm gonna quote this verse and tell my kids not to have tattoos, they're gonna tell me not to trim the sides of my hair.
I think that in general, cultures at that time, their physical appearance marked them as members of a certain
Yes.
group, people group, allegiance to certain gods,
Mhm.
worshippers of certain, idols. So it's almost like a way to
Yeah.
mark yourself, to show people where your allegiance lied.
Yes.
And so I think the Lord is just saying, you don't need those things. I think it could be confusing for outsiders.
For sure.
I wonder if it's also applicable to the spiritual realm, that when we do certain things, we are either aligning ourselves with the one true God
Mhm.
or the demonic, false gods, false religions.
Mhm.
So I tend to think that's still applicable, to not make tattoo marks. I mean, some people have done it before they do and gotten for
Yeah.
that, but at this point, it's interesting that it's like the marker of this generation.
I know.
I mean, in an over-the-top way, as we all have observed.
Right.
And you just wonder how, well, you don't wonder. We kind of know how we got to that place, it
Yeah.
seems.
Yeah. So I think my understanding, teaching and reading about these topics, because it also seems kind of interesting that that it seems like, and again, like original texts wouldn't necessarily have like paragraph markings and things like that we have now too. So some of this is like, do these really go together or do they not? But it seems like they were understood that they do, because translators have been doing this forever. But like this whole like trimming your hair and the cuttings on your flesh or tattoos are together. It's like, so it does kind of point to that all of these were part of mourning rituals. Now over time they've been interpreted to mean different things, and that's why you'll see Jewish people with, the curls or you often have beards or whatever. There's other things about that too, but because also like think about like when there's certain things of like the skin disease. I looked back and I was going to see if I could find this specific, but I can't find the specific verse right now. But if like when you have skin disease or something, part of the instruction for that is to shave your head, or like when you have a Nazarite vow, and at the end of it, the instruction, like when you complete it, you shave your head. So it's like, so again, the context matters, and that's why we're, what is it really talking about here? Is it saying never cut any of your hair? No, that's not what it's saying. But it's saying something here, and again, we've maybe lost a little bit of the cultural context. But you're right, that like a lot of this, a lot of times it is there. Things that you do with your hair and marks on your body have to do with mourning, and either sometimes worshiping the dead or just kind of weird rituals concerning the dead. And it seems that it's saying not to do that for the dead. How you regard death is very important to the Lord. As far as tattoos in general, there's a wide range of understandings of that. Some do say like, it's about death, so you don't get tattoos connecting with, I guess, honoring the dead or something like that. Some say you shouldn't do it at all, and there's the blood that's involved. So I'm not gonna make a definitive comment. Jewish tradition is no tattoos. There's some who make a distinction between Jew and Gentile and whether it's okay. I think the context matters. And there's always this idea of who does it. So I'm not willing to I'm not convinced enough by any to give like a definitive answer about exactly what it means and what is the right thing. But it's something to take lightly, certainly. So it's something that matters, and it's something that I think has to be processed out. And I think it goes back to the motivation behind it matters a lot. So I think I'll leave that one there. And we're at the end, so I'm going to read the end because then I want to make a couple comments. So I'll just read this last little section and then we'll kind of start to wrap up. So verse 30, you are to keep my Shabbatot and reverence my sanctuary. I am Adonai. Do not turn to those who are mediums or to soothsayers. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am Adonai your God. You are to rise up in the presence of gray-haired and honor the presence of the elderly. So you will fear your God. I am Adonai. If an outsider dwells with you in your land, you should do him no wrong. The outsider dwelling among you shall be to you as a native born among you. You shall love him as yourself. For you dwelled as outsiders in the land of Egypt. I am Adonai your God. You must not be dishonest in judgment, in measurements of length, weight, or of quantity. You are to have honest balances, honest weights, honest bushel measure, and an honest gallon. I am Adonai your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You must observe all my statutes and all my ordinances. Do them. I am Adonai. So, again, wide range of things here. But not turning to medium soothsayers. I think Robert Alter translates one of those as ghosts, and I was like, it really caught my attention. I was like, that's really interesting. Anyway, it just caught my attention. I don't really know what to make of that, but not turning to basically other sources of wisdom or manipulation, because ultimately that's what it comes down to, is manipulating outcomes of things. And it says that it defiles you. So going back again to this defiling, profaning process. Concept that we talked about earlier. And then this treatment of the outsider is really interesting, and I want to make a comment about that. But then we end with just honest measurements, right? So again, it goes back to like being above reproach, right? Of being honest and kind and thinking of others and not being selfish and greedy in how we deal with other people. So just as kind of a closing thing, because this is really interesting, and I think it helps us. It connects with other parts of the Bible, and it's just really, it's interesting to notice this, because these are sort of, well, I don't know if they're necessarily first, but in this whole chapter, there's 2 times when it talks about loving someone as yourself. So back up in verse 18, it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And then in verse 34, when it's talking about the outsider, you shall love him as yourself. So these are the only 2 times here in all of this that it talks about loving someone as yourself, and it's your neighbor and the outsider. Which really encompasses everyone then, right? So it's like you have to love your neighbor, yourself, and the outsider. So again, it's going back, but that's just that's much stronger than even a lot of the other instructions or just examples of how you deal with other people. Like there's a lot of talk about dealing honestly, but it's actually like you have to love them as yourself, which of course we know Yeshua emphasizes this as well. Loving your neighbor, loving the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? These are the two greatest commandments, and they're showing up. Here they are in Leviticus. It's like he knew. It's like he read Leviticus. It's like he was there or something. So I just wanted to point that out because I thought that's like feels like a good kind of. That to me that kind of sums up all of this. It's like when that is your perspective and that's your kind of lens at looking at all of this, when it's about loving neighbor, loving the foreigner among you, all of this kind of falls under all of that, right? So I just wanted to point that out and make that connection with Yeshua as well. And it is time to be done. So we had this. So this chapter is really interesting and covers a lot of topics. And it just seems like it really, I don't know, I just feel like it's a good like summary of like God's heart about how we deal with, about how we interact with one another, about how we are mindful of how our actions impact how we represent the Lord and his ability to dwell with and among us and in us. as well as how we care for land and things that we need to be watching out for and not falling into deception with. So I think it's a really interesting chapter. Again, it's interesting. We don't have time. Obviously, we didn't have time to go through all of it, but it's set right in the middle of 18, which is, lots of incest and other relationships that we're not to take part of. And then when you get into 20, you go right back into all of those relationships and their consequences for it. So the Lord is being really serious about how we regard ourselves, how we act, and how we act towards others, and what we do and what we don't do. So I don't know. I think it's a lot, and I think there's a lot that connects with even how Yeshua teaches in this. Like a lot of it, as I read through, again, like Hillary said at the very beginning, it took me right to the Sermon on the Mount, and it takes us to the 10 words and all of that. So all that to say, I like that this shows that the Lord is consistent. The character of God is consistent. What he expects of the people who follow him is consistent. And that is a good thing. Right? Like he's the God who doesn't change. And I think I find comfort in that. Even though I feel the weight of what he's calling us and what he's instructing us, I find comfort in that he doesn't change. Like his expectations don't change, and his character, his faithfulness, and he's faithful in that, and he's faithful to help us be able to walk the way that he's called us to walk. He doesn't set us up for failure. He doesn't set impossible paths before us. So anyway, thanks for joining the discussion on that this morning. So I will pray and go to service. So Lord, we do just thank you for your word. We thank you for your instruction. We thank you for showing us what holiness looks like, Lord. We thank you for showing us how to live so that your presence can dwell in us and among us, Lord. We do ask that you would just shine a light on any parts of our hearts that are not in line with who you've called us to be, Lord, and we just ask that you would bring them to our attention so that we can repent and turn away from those things, Lord, and so that we can walk with you more closely, Lord. So, Lord, we just ask for your presence to be with us in service. We ask that you would just be with each person who is leading in any capacity this morning, and that we would just all get to go together into your presence in a greater way, Lord. We thank you for Shabbat and for this weekly just this weekly acknowledgement of you and your kingdom together as a body of believers, Lord, that we get to worship you together, Lord, and that we get to feel heaven press a little bit closer to earth, Lord. So thank you, Lord, for your word, for your Shabbat, and for all the people who make it a priority to be here, and I just ask that you would just continue to be with us. In Hashem Yeshua.